I suppose I should preface this video by telling you a little bit of a story. Right now I'm actually in the middle of making these little counters for Dungeons and Dragons. My partner is in the middle of teaching somebody how to be a dungeon master. It's sort of part of her work, teaching this person to be a dungeon master in the game Dungeons and Dragons. And of course, one of the things you do, sort of, if you have like a grid pattern, is that you work with these counters. So the idea being is that these smaller ones are going to be NPCs, singular enemies, player characters and the like. The player characters are going to have like a round head and different styling on the base, whereas the NPCs and enemies, they're going to sort of have NPCs are going to have square heads, the enemies are going to have a triangular head, and they're going to sort of just have different designs with, you know, numbers and letters and all that sort of stuff just around the base. And then these bigger ones with a larger piece in the middle, they're going to be sort of like large enemies like dragons, basilisk, rat swarms, etc., etc., or even bosses, or especially rotund NPCs and player characters. All the worlds and stuff aside, I've been making these things pretty well since Saturday, and they're almost done. There's quite a few of them to do, but the way I start my morning, usually when I'm making things like this, is I'll go around through all my tools, and I will I will, sort of go through the process of sort of, tuning them up and making sure they're fine. So I'll clean my files, and I'll sharpen my spoke shaves and chisels. I probably shouldn't be sitting it like that. This here is one of those cheap spoke shaves. Long story short, they're pretty good, as long as you know how to tune it properly. And one of the tools that I, work with, quite regularly, and one of the tools that I, that is very important to me, especially, for the things I do as a craftsperson, as a hobbyist, as somebody who works with, raw materials, is the hand plane. And this hand plane was one of the first woodworking tools that I ever bought, one of the first carpentry tools, or one of the first cabinet making tools that I ever bought. If anything, it's probably one of the first. This was before I had chisels and hand saws. I had pruning saws, but not an actual hand saw specific to the art of working with wood to make something beautiful and functional. This tool, I bought this about 16 years ago for about $30. And it was just a no-name brand of tool. It was sitting next to a Stanley number 4 for about $200, and an Irwin record, which was about $300. And this guy here for $30, I was like, wow, I thought it was, a steal, because it had like wooden handles and it looked like the traditional number 4 and all those other things. Little did I know, when I bought this thing, 16 years ago, I was still in school, really. I was pretty well just finishing up school, and the most that I knew about a hand plane was that were all the ones that existed in high school through the woodworking classes. And from what I could gather from the use of those tools was that they were very satisfying to use, and they seemed fairly straightforward to set up. And little did I know that this specific tool would take me down a path that would teach me so many things. And I just want to make this video as a tribute, because I'm not entirely sure how this shows up on the camera, but maybe if I get a torch, you can kind of see these lines here There's some more just there. You know, there's one just back here. There's a few more just along there. And essentially what you're looking at are stress fractures all through the body of the plane. And how I discovered these is I was, you know, the sole on this is fairly flat. I mean, you can sort of see there's a bit of a hollow just here, you know, and there's quite a hollow just there. And I was thinking, well, you know, sort of I'll take it sort of to some finer sandpaper and polish up the sole, because I have this block plane and I polished up the sole on that and it made it run quite a bit smoother. You know, this is after flattening it and making sure it's nice and, you know, square to the mouth and the sides and the rest of the, you know, the rest of the tool. But as I was polishing it up, I dried it off and I'd used it for a little bit, and later on I'd picked it up and, you know, sort of just to admire my handiwork, and sure enough I'd discovered these stress fractures, which means that this tool is dead. This tool is no longer functional. I mean, it can still work as a plane, don't get me wrong, it's just these stress fractures will eventually just get worse and worse and worse, to the point where the plane would just literally fall apart in my hands. And that, see, I develop, you know, deep sentimental attachments to things, you know, especially for tools, because, you know, tools, I feel that you can understand a tool, but you always learn as you're using them. You know, like with a chisel, for example, like this here is just a cheap, you know, basic chisel, but it holds a decent edge surprisingly well. These are the first legitimate chisels that I ever bought, and whilst ever I have them, I'm still continuing to learn how to use them. And so, you know, sort of for such a simple device, and for, you know, for something that, you know, has existed for, you know, amongst humans for, you know, hundreds if not thousands of years, it's surprising that, you know, there's still things for somebody, you know, to learn about them. And I feel like with a cheaper tool like this, is that it gives me the opportunity to learn how to use them and learn from my mistakes. That I'm comfortable to make mistakes, because it's like, well, this is a cheap tool, that there's, you know, there's nothing really, there's not much to it. I mean, you know, for a cheap tool, it's like you manage to sort of get the flat of the thing, you know, fairly, it's actually flat, surprisingly. But regardless, with this tool here, when I bought this thing all those years ago, I didn't really know anything about it. I thought you just set the blade down and then you just cut away, like nothing else to it. And I realized, okay, the thing is blunt, and so I'd learned how to sharpen tools by hand. And then I discovered that the cap iron needed to sit flush against, that the lever cap needed to sit flush against the cap iron. And so I'd learned how to, you know, sort of, you know, grind this down so it actually sat flush against there. And this lever was also ground incorrectly, so I needed to learn how to make sure that this was the unlocked position and this was the locked position, which means that now that when I sit it in the blade, when I sit it in the plane, it actually marries up with the rest of the thing quite nicely. And, you know, then I also learned that the cap iron here needed to sit flush against the blade itself. You can sort of see it's still a little bit raised just over there. And so I'd learned that it needed to be shaped correctly. And so I'd learned a little bit more about that, and that it needed to sit fairly close to the actual edge of the blade as well. And so if I go ahead and remove this, sorry if I'm doing this off camera, it's just a little bit awkward to do it. I learned how to remove this tool, you know, remove the cap iron from the iron itself. This part here, the blade, is actually called the iron. And, you know, for a tool that was $30, this thing is extraordinarily good quality. Like, the wood that makes up these little counters here, this is hardwood, this is spotted gum, usually for decking timber. It's incredibly weather resistant, long wearing, and incredibly hard. And the older it gets, the harder it gets. There's some other things that I have, some other pieces of spotted gum which are probably over a century old, and for every few shavings you have to go back and sharpen the blade, and that's just the reality of incredibly well seasoned hardwood. With this stuff here, it's like I can plane this down to nothing before having to sharpen this blade. This is actually extraordinarily good tool steel for such a cheap tool. And then, and then of course another thing too is that I had to make sure that the frog was flat, and make sure that the frog sat square against the mouth here, and that the mouth was square to the sides and square to the sole, and then where the feet of the frog marry up with the body of the plane, that needed to be addressed as well. And so that took quite a while of filing and shaping and measuring and all that sort of stuff. And through this process, I'd learned about precision. And then another thing I'd managed to do with this tool was that, the knurling on this is actually very, very good. It's sort of like, it wobbles a little bit because it's sort of, the threads are a little bit peculiar, but, that's totally fine. I mean, it is a very old plane. I mean, it's not old. It's old enough, but, this tool is sort of, it's seen like a heck of a lot of use in all that time, and a heck of a lot of me learning how to do things, and a heck of a lot of me messing it up and learning what I did upon my messing it up, and then learning how to improve upon my mess ups, so that the mess ups are no longer mess ups but rather improvements. And of course, one of the things I did was that this little part here, this thing here, which I call this the wishbone, because it's essentially shaped like a wishbone, I suppose. But this here is your depth adjuster. So as you turn this outward, this little section here points downward. And what was happening was that this top section here was interfering with the spring tension component on the lever cap, and so as you were turning it down, it was sort of pushing this and causing the blade to chatter, because essentially it wasn't pressed against the face of the frog, it was pressed against this component just here. And so this, I welded the two together, so it actually operated properly, because the two pieces were just two separate pieces of sheet metal stamped out, and so I'd welded it together sort of for a little bit more structure and rigidity, and a little bit more precision against the cap iron here. It marries up just in there, and so I welded the two together, and I rounded the top of it, so at no point throughout the entirety of this length does it interfere with the spring on the lever cap just here. And another thing I'd managed to do was I'd welded some additional material onto here and ground it back, so the edges of the wishbone here have no play in the depth wheel. And because what would happen is, as you were let me just put everything back together, and I'll give you a little bit of demonstration as to why I did this, and why that level of that level of precision is important. I wouldn't exactly call it precision, I'd rather call it, you'll see what I mean when I manage to put this together. But essentially, as you're moving the blade inwards and outwards, there's quite a bit of play that happens as you're driving the blade in and out. And assuming that you had to move the blade outwards, of course, as you pull it back, you can sort of see there's still a little bit of movement in there, but as you're pulling it back, in order to set the blade a little bit like, so it's actually the right depth. What happens is that regardless, the tension on this guy here is such that it holds the blade in place to prevent it from moving side to side and all that sort of stuff. But it's not so tense that it can still be adjusted with the wheel even under tension from the lever, from the cap line just here. And so as you're pushing it through the wood and, you know, drawing shavings from the timber, there's quite a lot of force that is being applied into the blade and of course into the frog and the rest of the body by extension. And what happens is that it'll actually push the blade upwards ever so slightly. And the more play that's down here and the more play that's up there, it means that the force from pushing back up this way will also deliver the force back into here and push this up against here. So removing the play from here ensured that I could adjust it quite a bit more accurately and not have to spend all of the time fiddling it around and all that sort of stuff. You get the idea. You know, of course, another thing too is that I, you know, ground and polished all of the tops of the screws because I didn't want any sharp edges on here. It's like one of the things that I'd learned, or one of the things that, you know, I came across on Paul Sellers, and also working with a bunch of craftsmen. You know, I had, you know, this wonderful opportunity to work with a bunch of really old, you know, sort of tradespeople and craftsmen and whatnot. And one of the things that I had learned, which I think is very important as far as tools and tool making goes, and or even making anything, and I've learned that through this tool as well, is that anything that you make, that you handle, and that you live with, and all those other things, is that they have to feel good in the hand. They actually have to feel comfortable. So you can't have sharp edges, and the handle's got the, you know, the parts that have to be satisfying. It doesn't just have to look good. It doesn't just have to function, but it also has to be the kind of thing that as you're living with it, you're not having to regret every single time you pick it up. You know, when I first bought this thing, I used to regret having to pick it up because it operated so badly. But the more I'd learned about crafting, you know, about things like precision and about, you know, quality and about, you know, and other things, and how to modify this thing, and learning all of the, you know, like the ability to weld this together and the ability, you know, to grind everything down all precise and nice and everything else, is that over this time it developed into something that I had begun to love, and something that I had begun to really deeply appreciate, because, you know, I'd even, you know, managed, you know, shave down all the edges so that there isn't a single part of this that feels uncomfortable to hold. It actually feels like a good quality tool. But as you can see, one of the things that I cannot fix under any circumstances is the thickness of the sole. And because of all the pressures and all the years of this thing working in unusual conditions, the sole has eventually given up. The soul has left this body. And I've actually managed to find another tool, an old Stanley Bailey number 4, and, you know, hopefully with a little bit of restoration it will continue to service, you know, that tool will service me for, you know, for as long as this one has, and even longer. But, you know, I'd like to take a moment to really appreciate the concept of cheap tools, because this cheap tool, throughout its life and throughout the entirety of existence, this thing was just mass produced. It was, you know, not even a second thought for, like, you know, for the kids in wherever it was, you know, working in their sweatshop to actually put this together and you know, roughly cobble together all of these components. Like the handle, for example, you know, this handle, for example, is just made out of 2 pieces of wood just kind of glued together. Same thing with this here. They're literally just scrap pieces of wood just all cobbled together. And, you know, it was made sort of without a second thought. I'm assuming that, you know, that I suppose the general consensus was to make money. But, you know, through this forgotten, nondescript, no-name brand of tool, I'd learnt so many things throughout its life. And I don't think I ever would have learnt all of those things with a better quality tool. Like if I'd gotten a Lee Nielsen, it's like the thing is designed to be perfect right out of the box. There's nothing that you need to do about it. So you don't, if a great tool is something that you buy from the very beginning, it's like, yeah, that's all well and good. But for me, I'd learned about precision. I'd learned about the feel, like the feel of quality in the hand. I'd learned how to sharpen. And because of this blade here, I'd learned how to sharpen nearly anything by hand. And I'd learned about squareness. I'd learned about the satisfaction of using a tool that is designed to work. And the thing with the plane is that everything in it has to work perfectly. Everything has to work perfectly in unison in order for it to work properly, in order for it to actually do the job that it's supposed to do. It's very simple, but surprisingly complex in its execution. Because again, everything has to work absolutely perfectly in tandem. And for something that was never really sort of designed from the factory to be precise, the fact I managed to get it to that point where I could, make things like this, and even make things like that, all with this tool, and a couple other things, but you get the idea. This video has been going on for quite a while, but I regret having... I don't regret buying this tool. I regret that it's broken. I regret that I'll never be able to use it again. But if I had a choice between the brand new number 4, the brand new Irwin record, and this old girl, I'd pick this one hands down every time. That's plain to see.